Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that warm the heart and challenge the mind. Today's story is one of resilience, dignity, and justice. It follows the journey of a young girl, Nia Williams, navigating the pressures of an elite private school. After being humiliated by her teacher, Nia discovers that quiet strength is sometimes more powerful than retaliation. Stay with us as we unravel a powerful narrative that reminds us of the value of standing tall in the face of adversity, the power of family, and a twist you won't see coming. If stories of unexpected twists and life-changing moments speak to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story from Hopeful Horizon. Let us know where you're listening from. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Crestwood Academy, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors. Nia Williams shifted in her seat, her hands nervously clutching the edges of her notebook. Her classmates chatted idly around her, their voices a distant hum, but Nia's mind was elsewhere. Today was presentation day in English class, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. Crestwood was the kind of school where wealth and status spoke louder than words. Designer bags, shoes, and expensive watches were common, but for Nia, none of that mattered. She had always preferred her simple, comfortable clothes, soft sweaters, jeans, and sneakers. It wasn't that her family couldn't afford more, but Nia's mother, Selena, had raised her to value people for their character, not their appearance. That lesson had stuck with her, even in the halls of Crestwood, where judgmental glances and whispered comments followed her every move. As Mrs. Brooks, the English teacher, entered the room, the noise died down. Nia's stomach knotted as she saw the stern look on the teacher's face. Mrs. Brooks was known for her sharp tongue and harsh criticism, especially towards students who didn't fit her mold of excellence. Nia knew she was one of those students. "All right, class," Mrs. Brooks said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Let's get started. First up, Nia Williams." Nia's heart raced as she stood up, clutching her presentation papers. She walked to the front of the room, feeling the weight of her classmates' eyes on her. She could hear the faint whispers behind her, students gossiping about her clothes, her quiet demeanor, her perceived lack of status. But Nia kept her head high, just as her mother had taught her. As she began her presentation on the power of storytelling, her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. She spoke about how stories can transcend time and culture, how they can bring people together and foster understanding. For a moment, she felt a sense of pride. This was her passion, her strength. But then, just as Nia was finding her rhythm, Mrs. Brooks interrupted. "Interesting choice of topic, Miss Williams," Mrs. Brooks said with a smirk. "Though I'm curious, did you come up with that idea while shopping at wherever it is you get your clothes? Clearly, you're not spending much time in the same places as the rest of your classmates." The room erupted in stifled laughter. Nia felt her face flush with heat as her classmates' snickers echoed in her ears. She stood there, frozen, the humiliation washing over her like a tidal wave. But instead of letting it show, Nia straightened her back and took a deep breath. She forced herself to continue, ignoring the burning in her chest and the tears threatening to spill. Mrs. Brooks raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Let's move on," she said dismissively, waving Nia back to her seat. As Nia walked back to her desk, she heard the whispers again, louder this time. The humiliation was almost unbearable, but she refused to let it break her. She sat down, staring straight ahead, determined not to cry. By the end of the class, Nia couldn't wait to leave. As soon as the bell rang, she gathered her things and hurried out of the room, her head down. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never return. But even as she walked through the bustling hallway, trying to shake off the sting of Mrs. Brooks's words, she couldn't escape the shame that clung to her like a second skin. That evening, as Nia sat at the dinner table, her mother, Selena, noticed her daughter's uncharacteristic quietness. Selena was a sharp woman, one who had built her career on noticing the details others overlooked. Though she rarely talked about it, Selena was far more than just a successful businesswoman. She was the owner of Crestwood Academy, a fact she had kept hidden even from the school's faculty and administration. "Nia, sweetie, how was school today?" Selena asked, her voice soft but probing. Nia hesitated, picking at her dinner before finally meeting her mother's gaze. It was okay, she muttered, not wanting to burden her mother with her troubles. Selena raised an eyebrow. Just okay? For a moment, Nia debated whether to say anything. She had never wanted special treatment, and she certainly didn't want her mother to use her influence to fix things. But the weight of what had happened was too much to carry alone. Taking a deep breath, Nia recounted the events of the day, sparing no detail about Mrs. Brooks's cruel remarks and the humiliation she had endured in front of her classmates. As she spoke, Selena's expression darkened, though she remained composed. By the time Nia finished, her mother's silence was deafening. Selena took a deep breath before speaking, her voice calm but firm. "We'll handle this," she said simply, "but we'll do it our way." Nia frowned, confused by her mother's measured response. "You're not mad?" "Oh, I'm mad," Selena replied, a glint of steel in her eyes. "But I'm also patient, and I think it's time Mrs. Brooks learned a lesson." Nia's heart skipped a beat at her mother's words, but before she could ask what Selena meant, her mother gave her a reassuring smile. "Trust me, Nia," Selena said softly. "We'll make sure this never happens again. But we won't do it with anger. We'll do it with justice." The next morning, the tension in the Williams household had lifted slightly, but Nia still felt the sting of the previous day's humiliation as she packed her backpack for school. She couldn't shake Mrs. Brooks's words or the laughter of her classmates, no matter how hard she tried. Yet, her mother's calm assurance that they would handle things their way echoed in her mind. What did Selena mean by that? Selena, as always, was already dressed for work, her power suit crisp and her posture unshakably poised. As Nia entered the kitchen for breakfast, she found her mother sipping coffee at the dining table, scrolling through emails on her tablet. She looked up and smiled. "Ready for school, sweetie?" Selena asked, her voice warm and steady, as if everything were normal. Nia gave a slight nod. "Yeah, I guess." As Nia sat down, Selena set her tablet aside, her smile fading into a more serious expression. "I've already made a few calls this morning," she said, her tone even, but with an edge that Nia recognized as her mother's business voice. "Mrs. Brooks will be in for a surprise soon, but I need you to stay calm and trust me." Nia blinked, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What are you going to do?" Selena leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Nia's. "Let's just say that I've allowed certain people at Crestwood to run the show for far too long. Mrs. Brooks has been on my radar for a while, but now that her behavior has crossed a line, it's time for some changes." Nia felt her stomach flip. "Mom, I don't want you to use my position to give you special treatment," Selena interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "Don't worry, this isn't about special treatment, Nia. This is about creating an environment where no one has to go through what you did. Mrs. Brooks thinks she can get away with her behavior because she's never been held accountable. That changes today." Selena stood up, grabbing her keys from the kitchen counter. "Finish your breakfast, sweetie. You have a big day ahead, and so do I." By the time Nia arrived at school, the halls of Crestwood were buzzing with the usual chatter of students rushing to their classes. Nia kept her head down, her thoughts swirling. What was her mother planning? And why did Selena seem so calm, so confident? Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the school, Mrs. Brooks was making her way to a meeting she hadn't expected. The school's administration had called her in for a routine review, something they did for all teachers once a year. But this meeting felt different. For one, it was being held in the school's executive boardroom, a place Mrs. Brooks had never been invited to before. As she entered the room, her usual air of superiority faltered. At the head of the long, polished table sat a woman she had only seen in passing, Selena Williams. Mrs. Brooks's eyes narrowed as she tried to place the face, but before she could think too much, the principal greeted her. "Mrs. Brooks, thank you for coming," the principal said politely, motioning for her to take a seat. "This meeting won't take long, but it's important." Mrs. Brooks sat down, her eyes flicking between the principal and Selena. "I wasn't aware the board was reviewing my performance today," she said with a touch of annoyance. "What exactly is this about?" Selena remained silent, her expression unreadable, allowing the principal to continue. "Well, Mrs. Brooks, We've had several complaints regarding your treatment of students, the principal began cautiously. While we've often heard that your methods push students to excellence, there have been growing concerns about the fairness of your approach, particularly in how you address certain students like Nia Williams. At the mention of Nia's name, Mrs. Brooks shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I wasn't aware there were any real complaints. Nia Williams is a unique case. She doesn't always fit in, and I simply try to motivate my students to rise to the standards this school expects. Selena's calm voice finally broke the silence. Motivate. Is that what you call publicly humiliating a child for her clothes, Mrs. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks's eyes widened, suddenly recognizing the connection. She swallowed hard, her bravado slipping. I didn't mean to humiliate her. I was just... Enough, Selena cut in sharply, her eyes flashing. I've heard enough. I've been monitoring your behavior for a while now, and I know that this isn't an isolated incident. You've belittled other students, but what you did to my daughter crossed a line. The room fell deathly silent. Mrs. Brooks's face paled as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Nia's mother wasn't just another parent complaining about a teacher. Selena Williams was the owner of Crestwood Academy, the very institution Mrs. Brooks had felt so superior within. I had no idea, Mrs. Brooks stammered, trying to recover her composure. If I had known she was your daughter. It shouldn't matter who her mother is, Selena interrupted, her voice cold. No student deserves to be treated the way you treated Nia, and that's why I'm not firing you. Mrs. Brooks blinked, confused. You're not? No, Selena said firmly. Firing you would be too easy. Instead, I'm reassigning you to a new role, community outreach. Starting next week, you'll be working with students from underprivileged backgrounds, teaching them the same subjects you teach here. But there's more. You'll also attend anti-bias training and report directly to me. Consider it a second chance, Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. She wanted to protest, but something about Selena's unwavering gaze told her it would be futile. This is your only chance, Selena continued, standing up. I suggest you make the most of it. That afternoon, as Nia walked through the hallways of Crestwood, she noticed something different. The usual whispers and judgmental glances seemed to have faded, replaced by curious stares. Word of Mrs. Brooks's reassignment had spread quickly, and with it, a newfound respect for Nia. She didn't know the details of what had happened in that meeting, but when she saw Mrs. Brooks later that day, the once arrogant teacher looked different, defeated, humbled. And for the first time, Nia felt a sense of peace, knowing that justice had been served, not with anger, but with dignity. The days following Mrs. Brooks's reassignment marked a noticeable change at Crestwood Academy. The whispers about Nia soon faded into silence, and in their place grew an atmosphere of quiet admiration. Students who had once snickered at her began to greet her with a nod or smile in the hallways. It wasn't that she suddenly became popular overnight. Nia wasn't seeking that. Instead, it was a newfound respect, an acknowledgement of her quiet resilience. Mrs. Brooks, on the other hand, had become a shadow of her former self. Where she once strutted through the corridors with an air of superiority, she now walked with her head slightly bowed, avoiding eye contact with the students she used to belittle. The reassignments from the board had not only stripped her of her power, but they had also forced her to confront her biases and prejudices head-on. Every morning, she now reported to Selena Williams, who kept a close eye on her transition into her new role. Nia had always used her art as a form of escape, pouring her emotions and thoughts into the sketches that filled her notebooks. But after the incident, something changed. Art no longer just served as an escape. It became a voice, a powerful one. She began to take her craft more seriously, spending long hours after school in the art room, refining her skills and experimenting with new techniques. One Friday afternoon, as she worked on a new piece, the art teacher, Mr. Langston, approached her. He had always been kind to Nia, but today his tone carried a weight of admiration. "Nia, you've been putting in a lot of work lately," he said, his voice thoughtful as he glanced over her shoulder at the vibrant landscape she was painting. "You've always had talent, but lately, there's something different about your work. It's more expressive, more intentional." Nia paused, her brush hovering over the canvas. She looked up at Mr. Langston and smiled, realizing he had noticed the shift she'd felt within herself. "I guess I'm learning that sometimes it's okay to let people see more of who you really are," she said softly. He nodded, impressed. "Well, I wanted to tell you about something. The school's hosting an art showcase next month, and I think you should submit your work. It's a prestigious event, and your pieces would stand out." Nia's eyes widened. She had always loved art, but she never considered putting her work on display for others to see. "Really? Do you think my work is good enough?" Mr. Langston smiled, his eyes kind. "Without a doubt. You've grown, Nia, and your art reflects that. It's time for the world to see it too." Nia felt a swell of pride and excitement bloom in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged, on her own terms. She wasn't just the quiet girl in simple clothes. She was Nia Williams, an artist with a voice, and now she had a platform to show it. While Nia's confidence grew, Mrs. Brooks faced a journey of her own. The new role as community outreach teacher forced her out of her comfort zone, thrusting her into a world she had long dismissed. Working with underprivileged students, many of whom came from diverse backgrounds, challenged her biases in ways she hadn't expected. At first, Mrs. Brooks struggled. Her old ways of teaching, driven by superiority and a rigid sense of discipline, didn't resonate with these students. They didn't care about her past reputation or her intimidating demeanor. They needed empathy, understanding, and patience, qualities Mrs. Brooks had rarely shown. One afternoon, she was working with a group of students on a creative writing project. A young girl, no older than 14, was struggling to find the right words. Frustrated, the girl crumpled up her paper and threw it across the room. "Why even bother?" the girl muttered under her breath, arms crossed. Mrs. Brooks walked over, picking up the crumpled paper, and sat down beside her. For a moment, she was silent, remembering how she had often dismissed students who struggled, assuming they weren't trying hard enough. But now, sitting in this unfamiliar environment, Mrs. Brooks found herself seeing things differently. "You know," Mrs. Brooks began softly, "when I was your age, I used to struggle with my writing too. It wasn't easy for me to find the right words." The girl looked up, surprised. "You?" Mrs. Brooks nodded. "Yes, but I had a teacher who believed in me and pushed me to keep trying. I'd like to be that teacher for you if you'll let me." The girl stared at her for a moment, then slowly uncrossed her arms. "Okay, I'll try again." Mrs. Brooks handed the paper back to her and sat beside her as the girl began writing once more. It was a small moment, but for Mrs. Brooks, it was a revelation. The role she had been assigned, which at first felt like a punishment, was becoming a path to personal growth and understanding. One evening, after a long day at school, Nia sat in the living room with her parents. Selena was seated beside Ethan, her husband, who was flipping through a magazine while sipping tea. Nia had just finished telling them about Mr. Langston's suggestion to submit her work to the art showcase. "That's amazing, Nia," Ethan said proudly. "You've been working so hard on your art. It's time everyone sees just how talented you are." Selena smiled warmly. "I couldn't agree more. You have a gift, Nia, and I'm so proud of how you've handled everything lately. Not just with your art, but with how you've carried yourself through all the challenges at school." Nia blushed slightly, feeling the weight of their love and support. "I couldn't have done it without you two. Mom, the way you handled Mrs. Brooks. I don't know how you stayed so calm. I was so mad at her." Selena leaned forward, her expression soft but serious. "It's not always about reacting in the heat of the moment, Nia. Sometimes the best way to address injustice is with patience and strategy. People like Mrs. Brooks don't change overnight, but they can be given the opportunity to grow. That's what I wanted, for her to learn, not just to be punished." Nia nodded, understanding now what her mother had meant. Selena had done more than just protect her daughter. She had set an example of grace and dignity, choosing a path that could lead to real change, not just retribution. "I just hope she learns from it," Nia said quietly. Selena placed a hand on Nia's. "She already is." As the weeks passed, life at Crestwood Academy continued to shift, and the ripples of Nia's quiet strength spread through the school. While Nia grew more comfortable in her own skin, it became clear that Mrs. Brooks was still grappling with her new reality. Her forced humility and work with the underprivileged students challenged her in unexpected ways, and though she remained distant with most of the faculty, there were small glimpses of change. Nia had been throwing herself into preparations for the upcoming art showcase. Every afternoon, she could be found in the art room, working on her final piece. It was different from anything she had created before, a vibrant and emotional abstract painting that represented the storm of emotions she had been navigating over the past few months. Colors clashed and danced on the canvas, symbolizing both the chaos of the discrimination she faced and the peace she had found within herself. One afternoon, as she was putting the finishing touches on the piece, she heard a voice from behind her. "You've got quite a gift, Nia." Nia froze, recognizing the voice immediately. Mrs. Brooks. The teacher who had humiliated her in front of the class was now standing behind her, observing her artwork. Nia didn't know how to feel. Anger, discomfort, maybe even pity. But she stood up straight and turned to face her, meeting her eyes. Mrs. Brooks looked different. The sharp arrogance that had once defined her features had softened, and she seemed almost hesitant. "I didn't know you were such a talented artist," Mrs. Brooks continued, her voice quieter than Nia had ever heard it. Nia's heart raced. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but she wasn't interested in small talk. "Is there something you need, Mrs. Brooks?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. For a moment, Mrs. Brooks said nothing, her eyes flicking between Nia and the canvas behind her. Then, with a deep sigh, she sat down in one of the empty chairs nearby, as though the weight of her past actions was suddenly too heavy to carry. "I owe you an apology, Nia," she began, her voice unsteady. "What I did, the way I treated you, it was wrong." Nia blinked in surprise. Of all the things she had expected to hear from Mrs. Brooks, an apology wasn't one of them. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She stared at the older woman, whose once imposing figure now seemed small and vulnerable. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mrs. Brooks continued, wringing her hands in her lap. "But I've had a lot of time to reflect on what happened. And working with these students in my new role, it's made me realize how deeply ingrained my biases were. I thought I was pushing students to excellence, but in reality, I was only pushing them down. And I hurt you in the process." Nia crossed her arms, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to lash out, to remind Mrs. Brooks of how cruel she had been, how she had humiliated her in front of the entire class. But another part of her, the part that had learned so much from her mother's grace and patience, knew that anger wasn't the solution. It wouldn't bring her peace. "I appreciate the apology," Nia said quietly, "but it doesn't erase what happened." Mrs. Brooks nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I know, and I'm not asking for you to pretend it never happened, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, not just for you, but for all of the students I've wronged." Nia sighed, feeling the weight of her own emotions bubbling to the surface. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone, made me feel like I didn't belong. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Mrs. Brooks swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "I do now, more than you realize. Being in this new position, working with students who face challenges I never had to think about, it's opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect." There was a long pause as the two stood in the quiet art room, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. Nia studied Mrs. Brooks, searching for any hint of insincerity, but she found none. The older woman seemed genuinely remorseful, and it was clear that her reassignment had forced her to confront some painful truths about herself. After what felt like an eternity, Nia spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you, but I can see that you're trying, and that's something." Mrs. Brooks smiled sadly. "That's all I can ask for." The day of the art showcase arrived, and the atmosphere at Crestwood Academy buzzed with excitement. Students from all grades had gathered in the grand hall, where the walls were adorned with artwork from the most talented artists in the school. Nia's painting was displayed prominently near the front, and as she stood before it, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in her chest. Her parents stood by her side, beaming with pride. Selena had her arm around Nia's shoulder, while Ethan took pictures of the artwork on his phone. "You've outdone yourself, Nia," Selena said, her voice filled with emotion. This is beautiful. Nia smiled up at her mother. Thanks, Mom. I'm really proud of it. As the showcase continued, students and parents alike stopped to admire Nia's painting, many complimenting her on her creativity and talent. For the first time in a long while, Nia felt like she belonged, not because of who her mother was, but because of what she had created. Towards the end of the evening, Mr. Langston approached Nia, a proud smile on his face. Your piece is getting a lot of attention, Nia. I knew you had it in you. Nia grinned. Thanks, Mr. Langston. I couldn't have done it without your support. Just then, Mrs. Brooks appeared at the edge of the crowd. She lingered for a moment, watching Nia from afar, before finally making her way over. Nia noticed her approach and felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she stood her ground. Mrs. Brooks looked at the painting for a long moment, then turned to Nia with a soft smile. It's beautiful, Nia. Truly. Nia nodded. Thank you. There was a pause, and then Mrs. Brooks took a deep breath. You've inspired me, Nia. I've been working with the students in my new role, and I've realized just how much I have to learn. I hope that one day I can create something as meaningful as this. Nia didn't know how to respond, but she appreciated the sentiment. I'm glad you're trying, she said after a moment. Mrs. Brooks smiled again, this time more warmly. Me too. As Mrs. Brooks walked away, Nia felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. She had faced her greatest challenge with grace, and now she stood tall, confident in who she was and what she had to offer. The evening after the art showcase, Nia sat in her room reflecting on everything that had happened. The showcase had been a success, and even more importantly, she had confronted Mrs. Brooks in a way that she hadn't anticipated. Nia's life was changing, not just because of what had transpired with Mrs. Brooks, but because she was finally beginning to understand her own strength. Still, there was something gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, something her mother had said the night Mrs. Brooks humiliated her in front of the class. We'll handle this our way, Selena had promised. So far, her mother had kept that promise with poise and tact, but Nia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. She glanced at her clock. It was nearly midnight, but she knew her mother was still awake, likely finishing up some work in her study. Gathering her courage, Nia left her room and padded quietly down the hallway toward her mother's office. The door was ajar, and through the small crack, Nia could see Selena typing furiously on her laptop, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Nia knocked gently. Mom? Can we talk? Selena looked up from her work, a gentle smile playing on her lips. Of course, honey. Come in. Nia entered the room and sat on the plush chair across from her mother's desk. For a moment, she didn't know where to start, but the curiosity that had been building in her finally pushed her forward. I was just thinking about what you said the night after Mrs. Brooks embarrassed me in class, Nia began cautiously. You said we'd handle it our way. I know you gave her that new role at school, but was that it? Is there more? Selena's smile widened, though there was a hint of something else in her eyes, something almost mischievous. You're very observant, Nia, she said, leaning back in her chair. Yes, there's a bit more. I wanted to make sure Mrs. Brooks learned her lesson, not just through her demotion, but by understanding the value of empathy. Nia raised an eyebrow. How do you mean? Selena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened landscape beyond their home. Mrs. Brooks has been teaching at Crestwood for a long time. She's grown comfortable in her ways, and in doing so, she's forgotten the most fundamental aspect of education, caring for her students. I didn't just want to punish her, Nia. I wanted her to grow, to become someone better, for herself and for the school. Nia nodded slowly, understanding her mother's logic. So, what did you do? Selena turned back to face her daughter, her eyes twinkling with determination. I arranged for a mandatory staff meeting at the school. Tomorrow, the board will meet with all the faculty, including Mrs. Brooks. They'll be given a choice. Take part in an intensive workshop designed to challenge their biases and rewire the way they think about their students. Or resign. Nia blinked, surprised. A workshop? Her mother nodded. It's an immersive program I've been developing with some colleagues for a while now. It's designed to help educators confront their own implicit biases and develop strategies to create more inclusive, supportive learning environments. It's not an easy process, but I believe it's necessary for real change. For a moment, Nia was speechless. She had always known her mother was a brilliant woman, but this was something else entirely. "Wow," Nia said softly. That's amazing, Mom." Selena smiled again, though this time it was softer, more reflective. "I just want to make sure no other child has to go through what you did, Nia. This is about more than just Mrs. Brooks. It's about creating a better environment for every student at Crestwood." Nia's heart swelled with pride, but there was still one thing bothering her. "Do you think Mrs. Brooks will really change? I mean, she apologized, but I don't know. It's hard to imagine her being different." Selena sighed and returned to her desk. "I don't know either. Change is hard, and not everyone is willing to face their flaws. But if she doesn't, well, then she'll have to live with the consequences of her choices. This workshop isn't a magic solution, but it's a start." Nia nodded thoughtfully, mulling over her mother's words. The idea of forcing Mrs. Brooks to confront her own biases, along with the rest of the faculty, was both exciting and daunting. It made sense, though. True change couldn't come from a single action. It had to be nurtured and developed over time. "Thank you, Mom," Nia said, standing up, "for everything. I know this hasn't been easy for you either." Selena reached across the desk and squeezed Nia's hand. "I'm proud of you, Nia. You've handled all of this with grace and strength, and no matter what happens next, I'll always have your back." Nia smiled, feeling a sense of warmth and security that only her mother could provide. "I know. I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart." The next morning, Crestwood Academy was abuzz with nervous energy. The faculty had gathered in the large conference room for the mandatory meeting, whispers of speculation filling the air. Mrs. Brooks sat near the back of the room, her heart pounding. She had heard rumors of the meeting's purpose, but no one seemed to know exactly what was going to happen. The room fell silent as the door at the front opened, and Selena Williams entered, accompanied by Mr. Langston and several other board members. Mrs. Brooks's eyes widened as she recognized Nia's mother. She had been expecting her to be involved in the school's future, but seeing her in this setting, leading the charge for change, was still unnerving. Selena took her place at the front of the room, her gaze sweeping across the assembled teachers and staff. When she spoke, her voice was calm but commanding, instantly demanding the room's attention. "Thank you all for being here today," Selena began. "I know many of you are wondering why this meeting was called and what it means for the future of Crestwood Academy. I won't waste your time with pleasantries. I'm here to address an issue that has gone unchecked for far too long." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "As educators, we have a responsibility to nurture, support, and inspire our students. But for some time now, certain behaviors and attitudes have taken root in this institution, behaviors that do not align with our mission to foster an inclusive and respectful learning environment." Mrs. Brooks shifted uncomfortably in her seat, knowing that Selena's words were aimed directly at her, though she wasn't alone in feeling the tension in the room. "This meeting is not about punishment," Selena continued. "It's about growth. Each of you will have the opportunity to participate in a new program designed to help you confront your own biases and become more empathetic, effective educators. However, participation is not optional. If you choose not to take part, you will be asked to resign." A murmur of shock spread through the room, but Selena remained composed. "This is not about blame or shame," she said firmly. "It's about making this school a better place for our students, every single one of them. The choice is yours." The tension in the room was palpable. Teachers exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing at the implications of Selena's announcement. Some seemed eager to embrace the change, others visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. At the back, Mrs. Brooks sat frozen, her stomach churning. This was it, the moment she had feared ever since her confrontation with Nia's mother. The consequences she had tried to avoid were now staring her in the face. Selena stood confidently at the front of the room, her presence commanding respect. As the murmurs quieted, she continued, her voice calm but resolute. I understand that this is a significant shift, but it's necessary. The culture we create as educators has a profound impact on the lives of our students. We cannot tolerate behavior that demeans, humiliates, or excludes anyone based on their background, economic status, or appearance. The weight of her words hung in the air. Mrs. Brooks knew this was about her, about how she had treated Nia. A part of her wanted to argue, to justify her actions as tough love, or pushing students toward excellence. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. Her bias had blinded her to the damage she'd caused, and now she had to face it. Mr. Langston, the principal, stepped forward. The workshop is comprehensive and immersive. It will challenge you to examine your own beliefs, question long-held assumptions, and build better connections with your students. It's about growth, not punishment. Selena nodded and gestured toward the door at the back of the room, where a team of facilitators was waiting. Those of you who are ready to begin this journey of self-reflection and change will meet with the facilitators immediately after this meeting. They'll walk you through the program and explain the next steps. For those who feel they cannot commit to this process, we ask that you submit your resignation by the end of the week. There was a stunned silence. No one had expected the ultimatum to be so stark. Mrs. Brooks felt her pulse quicken. Could she handle this? Could she really go through a workshop that would force her to confront her biases? The thought of being humiliated in front of her peers, exposed for her faults, terrified her. But the alternative, resigning, admitting failure, walking away from the career she had built, was just as terrifying. As the meeting adjourned, teachers began to file out, some heading toward the facilitators with hesitant steps. Mrs. Brooks remained seated, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't ready to face Selena directly, not yet, but she couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Meanwhile, Nia sat in her art class, unaware of the meeting taking place in the boardroom. The events of the past few days had left her feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The art showcase had been a triumph, and her mother's handling of Mrs. Brooks had given her a sense of validation, but there was still a part of her that wondered what would happen next. As she sketched quietly at her desk, a familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Nia, can I talk to you for a second?" She looked up to see Mr. Langston standing in the doorway. Her heart skipped a beat, worried that something had gone wrong. She nodded, putting down her pencil and following him out into the hallway. "Nia," he began, "I just came from a meeting with your mother and the faculty. I want you to know that we've taken what happened with Mrs. Brooks very seriously. Your mother's leadership in addressing the situation has been nothing short of remarkable." Nia smiled slightly, though she still felt unsure. "Thank you. I'm just glad it's being dealt with." Mr. Langston nodded. "I also wanted to tell you something personally. Your mother has spoken very highly of you, not just as her daughter, but as a student. She believes you have the potential to make a significant impact here at Crestwood, and I agree with her." Nia blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Starting next semester, we'd like to invite you to join the student council. We believe your voice, your perspective, could help shape the school's future." Nia was stunned. "Me? On the student council?" Mr. Langston smiled. "Yes, you've already demonstrated incredible resilience and leadership. It's time we recognize that officially." Nia felt a surge of pride. Her mother's influence had certainly opened doors, but this was about her own ability, her own strength. She had never considered herself a leader, but maybe it was time to start. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. "I hope you do," Mr. Langston replied. "You have a lot to offer." Later that afternoon, Mrs. Brooks sat in her empty classroom, the reality of her situation sinking in. She had been given a choice: participate in the workshop or resign. It wasn't a simple decision. Her pride told her to walk away, to leave Crestwood with whatever dignity she had left. But another part of her, the part that had been shaken by Nia's grace and Selena's firm but fair approach, knew that walking away would be admitting defeat. She glanced at the stack of papers on her desk, assignments from her students, most of whom she had pushed hard, some of whom she had hurt. For years, she had justified her behavior, convinced that tough love was the only way to get results. But now she was beginning to see the cracks in that belief. Mrs. Brooks took a deep breath. The workshop terrified her, but she also knew it was her last chance to make things right. not just with Nia, but with herself. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for the facilitator. "I'd like to sign up for the workshop," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for your courage, Mrs. Brooks," the voice on the other end replied. "We'll see you tomorrow." The following week, Crestwood Academy was buzzing with a new sense of energy. The faculty had begun the anti-bias workshop, and the students could already feel the shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Brooks, once the feared and aloof teacher, had started to change. She was quieter, more reflective, and though the road ahead would be long, she had taken the first step toward becoming the educator she had once aspired to be. Nia, meanwhile, found herself stepping into her new role on the student council, her confidence growing with each passing day. The respect she had earned from her peers, not because of her mother's status, but because of her own strength, filled her with a sense of belonging she had never felt before. As for Selena, her work was far from over. She continued to guide the school with a firm but compassionate hand, ensuring that Crestwood Academy would become a place where all students, regardless of their background, could thrive. The Parker family's legacy at Crestwood had only just begun, but it was clear that a new era had dawned, one where kindness, empathy, and justice would prevail. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of courage, accountability, and change. Nia's story reminds us that standing up for what's right can create ripples of transformation, even in the most unexpected places. It's a testament to the power of quiet strength, the importance of empathy, and the value of confronting our own biases. If you've been inspired by this story, don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss another impactful story. We'll be back with more tales that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over. Thank you for being a part of our community. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay strong, and always fight for what's right.